Hi, my name is Jo Marchant. I'm a science journalist, and tonight I'm going to talk about the Antikythera mechanism, which I think is the most exciting object that we have from the ancient world. It's the remains of a complex mathematical device that was found after spending 2,000 years under the sea, and I'm going to talk about how it was discovered, how its mystery was solved, and what it means for our thinking about what the ancient Greeks were capable of, and for the roots of our own science and technology.
So good evening and welcome to tonight's Darwin College lecture. And as you know, our theme this year is enigmas. Now, every time I walk down King's Parade here in Cambridge, I'm struck by the crowds of people admiring the Corpus Christi clock, the chronophage or the time eater, which has that monster grasshopper walking along the top of the clock, releasing the escape wheel cog by cog. It was John Harrison, an 18th century carpenter and clockmaker, who invented the grasshopper escapement, and that meant for over a century his long case clocks were the most accurate in the world. However, he was most famous for designing clocks that could keep accurate time in ships at sea, and so enabled longitude to be precisely determined from astronomical observations. Up to then, longitude being a huge and long-standing problem for navies and sailors in general. So while the motion of planets can be tracked with telescopes, their motion can also be predicted with clocks. And the Greeks and the Romans were deeply interested in astronomical motion. So the Greek Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that they had been going down the same route that John Harrison and others followed almost 2 millennia later, using gears and wheels. It was a complicated instrument, apparently designed to predict the heavenly motions, and must have required fine engineering skills to design and build it. So tonight, we have Dr. Jo Marchant, who's going to take us back 2,000 years and explore the mysteries around this complex instrument. And the title of her lecture, as you can see, being the Antikythera mechanism. So, Jo, welcome. So, yeah, well done.
Thank you. Tonight I want to tell you about what I think is the most exciting object that we have from the entire ancient world. And yep, it's not a classical statue or vase or an Egyptian mummy or a beautiful piece of golden jewelry. It's a collection of ancient battered bronze pieces called the Antikythera mechanism. So this is the largest piece. So the Antikythera mechanism is now held in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It was found on a shipwreck after 2,000 years under the sea, and it's the remains of a complex mathematical machine, and it completely mystified scholars when it was first discovered. There's nothing else like this in the historical record. It's unique. Anything close to this sophistication occurs before it in the historical record, and nothing close to this appears after, for well over 1,000 years afterwards. So tonight I want to tell you about how this object was discovered, how its sort of mysteries were decoded. It's a project that took over a century to work out what this thing is. And I want to talk a bit about what the answers that have been gleaned from these fragments mean for our understanding of what the ancient Greeks were capable of and for the roots of our own science and technology. So the modern story of this mechanism starts in the year 1900 with a group of sponge divers. So the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Sponge diving was a thriving industry across the Mediterranean Sea. And the sponge divers used these canvas and rubber suits with heavy metal helmets, and they breathed compressed air that was fed through a hose from the boat above. And that was very dangerous. The dangers of the bends really weren't understood at the time. Thousands of divers were dying of the bends at this time. But nevertheless, lots of crews of sponge divers would sail out every spring, harvest sponges for the summer, and sail back again in the autumn. And in the spring of 1900, a captain called Demetrios Kontos and his crew set sail from the island of, where's my pointer? I can't see it. The island of Symi, anyway, hopefully you can see it marked on the map. They were from Symi in the Aegean Sea, and they sailed west and south down to the coast of North Africa, off Libya, where they collected sponges for the summer, and then in the autumn they sailed back. And on one of those journeys, we're not sure which of those journeys, but on one of them they were blown off course by a storm, and they sheltered by the island of Antikythera. So this is Antikythera. You can see it's beautiful, but it's barren, and it's got these treacherous, steep, rocky cliffs. And they sheltered in a little harbour there. And once the storm had died down, one of the divers went down into the water. And the story goes that he very quickly came back up again, terrified, saying to the others that he had seen a pile of dead, naked women and horses on the seabed. The captain put on the suit, they had just the one suit between them, went down to have a look, and he did indeed see figures about 60 meters down, but he realized that they weren't corpses, they were statues, bronze and marble statues. So the divers had come across an ancient wreck that was full of treasure. So they reported it to the Greek authorities. They took a bronze arm with them as proof of their find, and they were hired to salvage the wreck under the direction of official archaeologists. And that makes this a very important wreck in the history of marine archaeology. This was the first time that archaeologists had investigated a shipwreck. It was very dangerous work. They salvaged the wreck for 10 months between November 1900 and September 1901. The weather was terrible. One of them died of the bends. Another one was paralyzed. But they brought back what at the time was the most incredible haul of objects from the ancient world that had ever been discovered. And they were all shipped back to the museum in Athens. And this included bronze and marble statues. There was bronze armor, including helmets and shields. There was parts of furniture, ornate bedsteads, parts of a bronze throne. There was golden jewelry, and lots of pottery, luxury glassware. This is one of the most famous finds from the Antikythera wreck. It's called the Antikythera Youth, a bronze statue that dates from around the 4th century BC. There were also a lot of marble statues brought back. That top picture is the sponge divers in their two little boats. And then here you've got some of the marble statues that were brought back to the museum. So they tended to be in much worse state. They were corroded, eaten away by sea creatures. Some of them had beautifully preserved details, though. This statue here of a crouching boy, so it was half buried in the sediment when it was brought up. So you can see the other half has been eaten away, but that half is beautifully preserved. This is one of my favorite finds from the Antikythera wreck. It's the head of a statue, and it's thought to be a portrait of a particular philosopher. We don't know who he was, with the eyes inlaid with stone, dating from around the 3rd century BC. So that's just to get across that the Antikythera shipwreck, even without anything else, would still be one of the most important shipwrecks that's been discovered from an archaeological point of view. And so the staff were trying to deal with all these thousands of objects that were being brought back, a lot of them in pieces. They're trying to fit everything together. Any kind of fragments that were unidentified or didn't look very interesting were just left in crates in the museum courtyard. And in May 1902, a visitor to the museum realized that one of these sort of lumps, this lump of bronze, had broken open. And what he saw inside seemed impossible. He saw remains of intricate gear wheels, measuring scales, lots and lots of inscriptions. So this is the largest piece. This is called fragment A. And so you can see that there's this big gear wheel there with 4 spokes in the shape of a cross. You can see the little triangular teeth that are cut all around the edge. And then behind that, there are a lot more smaller gear wheels with their teeth, and you can see other mechanical components there. This is 2 more fragments. So on this one, you can see what look like perhaps concentric sort of circular dials. There's inscriptions there. Here you've got this double scale, sort of precisely marked measuring scale. Looks like a sort of modern protractor that you might use for measuring angles. More inscriptions. And it's really hard to overemphasize just how incredible this find was. So there was no other example of a gear wheel known surviving from the ancient world, like not a single one. No example surviving of a measuring scale. So this was just completely different to anything that had been found before. So nothing sort of close to this kind of complexity appears again in the historical record until the development of mechanical clocks, and that was well over 1,000 years later. So various experts were drafted in to try and work out what this thing was. Only a few words at this point could be deciphered from the inscriptions, but they included some astronomical terms. So one idea was that this might be an astrolabe. So that's the device where you have one disk that rotates over another to represent the movement of the stars in the sky, but they don't have gear wheels. Another idea was maybe a planetarium, but nothing like that is known from the ancient world. Maybe it was just a hoax or a mistake. So people were really sort of flummoxed by this. And then during the Second World War, a lot of the artifacts from the Athens Museum, including the Antikythera mechanism, were taken and hidden under the floors, buried in sand to hide them from the invading Nazi army. A lot of this work was forgotten. After the war, everything was got back out. A lot of items were put back on display, but the Antikythera mechanism never was. It was just left forgotten in a storeroom, this thing that didn't really look like much, and nobody really knew what it was. Until this man, this is Derek de Solla Price, rediscovered it. So he was born in East London in the 1920s. He trained as a physicist originally, but then he moved to Yale to become the US's first professor of the history of science. And he was fascinated by the history of scientific instruments, and especially astronomical instruments. And he really felt that tracing this tradition of devices was key to tracing the progression of human knowledge. So he did a variety of projects on different artifacts, trying to sort of trace this tradition of technology further and further back. One of the things that he looked at was the Tower of the Winds in the Greek marketplace in Athens. So this is this stone tower dating to around the 1st century BC. It's octagonal, and it's got carvings on each of its sides representing the 8 winds. It's empty, but from markings on the marble floor, Price was able to reconstruct a giant clock that once stood there. So it was a water clock driven by a local stream. And so just by a couple of gear wheels, that the water was used to drive a giant bronze disc with the stars sort of carved onto it, representing the sky, that would have turned in line with the heavens. But then he discovered something much more impressive than this, the Antikythera mechanism. So he studied it. He worked with a researcher in Greece to try to read more of the inscriptions now that a lot of the fragments had been cleaned. And they were able to read more snatches of text. So there's this double scale here, and on the outer scale, they were able to read the words Pakon and Paini. These are month names. So this outer scale looks as if it was a calendar divided into the 365 days of the year and separated into the 12 months. So a dial representing the year, and on the inside, Kelai and Parthenos. So these are signs of the zodiac, Libra, Virgo. So this inner scale would have been divided into the 360 degrees of the sky and the 12 signs of the zodiac. And of course, the sun, during the course of a year, sort of moves through in a circle around the sky through these background stars. So a pointer that moved around this dial would have shown you both the date in the year and the position of the sun in the zodiac. There were other snatches of text. Vega rises in the evening, the Hyades set in the morning. So these are telling you different events, things that the stars were doing at different times of year. And Price realized that there were little kind of solo letters at different points around this dial that led to these other bits of text. So they were basically giving you more information about what the stars were doing at different times of year. Other bits of text seem to be kind of looking as if they were perhaps operating instructions. So he wasn't able to get much further than this. At this point, he wasn't able to see what was really happening inside the mechanism. But already he started to realize its importance. So mechanical gearing was a really crucial technology. It enabled the development of mechanical clocks, so accurate timekeeping. It also enabled the automated machinery that drove the Industrial Revolution. So Price realized that here's this technology that is thought of as having really shaped the modern world, and yet here was proof that it actually had its roots in ancient Greece. So he wrote that the Antikythera mechanism was as spectacular as if the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb had revealed the decayed but recognizable parts of an internal combustion engine. So he wasn't given to understatement Price. And then in the 1970s, he had another breakthrough because he worked with another researcher in Athens to X-ray the fragments. So this technology was just becoming usable for archaeological artifacts. And so for the first time in 2,000 years, the internal structure of these fragments was revealed. And crucially, he could start to, he identified a lot more gear wheels, and he could start to count the teeth on those wheels and therefore start to work out what was being calculated inside the mechanism. And so just to quickly, it worked on the same principle as clocks. So you've got gear wheels driving around other gear wheels, and depending on the number of teeth, you can do mathematical calculations. So if you imagine that you had one gear wheel with 20 teeth and it was driving another wheel with 10 teeth, then for every one turn of the 20-tooth wheel, your 10-tooth wheel is going to turn twice. So you've multiplied your speed by 2, or in fact -2, because it's going the other way. And in clocks, gear wheels are used to multiply speeds by factors of 60 to turn seconds into minutes and hours. But the calculations that were going on inside the Antikythera mechanism were a lot more complicated than this. So he was able to decipher, in particular, one set of 6 gear wheels that led directly from the input of the mechanism. So essentially, he worked out that this was a mechanism that would have been held in a wooden case, looking a bit like a modern clock, about the size of a shoebox, turned by a handle on the side. And then that handle, he figured, was driving a pointer showing the movement of the sun. So one turn of that pointer would represent a year. And then he saw this train of 6 gear wheels. And when he worked out the calculation that was doing, it was multiplying the input speed by 254 over 19, which might sound like quite a random number, but he knew enough ancient astronomy to know that this was a reference to a calendar called the Metonic cycle that was used by the ancient Greeks to harmonize the motions of the sun and the moon. So it's quite tricky to have a straightforward calendar that tracks both the sun and the moon, because 12 lunar months do not fit exactly into one solar year. So each year, your full and new moons will fall on different dates. But the Greeks knew that after 235 months, or 19 years, they do come back into sync. And again, your phases of the moon will occur on the same dates as they did on the first year. So they used to use this 19-year calendar to bring together both the sun and the moon. And that's synodic months, tracking the phase of the moon. There's another kind of month called a sidereal month, which measures the time it takes for the moon to go exactly one orbit around the Earth and come back to the same position with respect to the background stars. The timing of that is slightly different. And in this cycle, 19 years is 235 synodic months, is 254 sidereal months. So essentially, for every 19 turns of the sun through the sky, the moon will turn 254 times. So essentially, what this gear train was doing was taking the speed of the sun and translating it into the speed of the moon. So as you're turning the handle, it's driving a sun pointer, but then through this gear train, it can also drive a moon pointer going around once a month. So Price still had lots of questions about the mechanism. He didn't really know what was happening on the back of the mechanism, but he knew that there was one dial on the front with a sun and a moon pointer, and so he figured that he had solved what this thing was. He saw it as a calendar computer, tracking the movements of the sun and the moon through the sky. So Price died in 1983, but his work was continued by this man. This is Michael Wright. At the time, he was a a young curator at the Science Museum in London. This is a more recent picture of him. And he is a mechanician. He loves making models, loves ancient gearing. This is his little workshop in his home in London. And he was really interested in Price's work. It was really brilliant insights that he had. But the more that Michael Wright looked at it, the more he realized that there was an awful lot more to this mechanism, a lot more to be discovered about it. So he traveled to Athens several times in the 1990s and took his own X-ray images. And part of the problem with Price's images was they were flat, two-dimensional. All the wheels are kind of on top of each other. You can't really tell how they're arranged. So Wright built a crude tomography machine where he could, as he took the images, he could swing the object, the fragments and the film together with respect to the X-ray source. And you can do that in such a way so that only one plane is in focus at the same time, so you could start to separate out the sort of 3 dimensions of how the wheels are arranged. And then he built what he saw. So this is from his model of the Antikythera mechanism. He just cut the wheels himself and built them out of a sheet of brass. One of the things that he did was started to work out what was going on the back of this mechanism. So this is where those concentric circles were, except that he was the first person to realize that they're not actually concentric circles at all. They were spirals. So there's 2 dials, one above the other, made of these spiral slots, and the pointers they were extendable arms with a little needle at the end that drops down into the slot, just like the stylus on a record player. And so they would each start at the middle, run through the spiral, and then when they got to the end, the user would lift them up and put them back to the beginning again. And Wright was also able to count the number of divisions on this top spiral and realized that it came to 235, exactly the number of months in the Metonic cycle. So through looking at the gear train leading to this as well, he realized that this was a lunisolar calendar showing the dates of the new and full moons across the 19 years of that Metonic cycle. There's actually, he saw this little dial in the middle there on the right as well, and that's divided into 4. And he initially assumed that this was a longer and more accurate period that was used by the Greeks, known as the Calippic cycle, which is made up of 4 Metonic cycles, or 76 years. Actually, more recently, the latest readings of the inscriptions have shown that actually this was a 4-year dial, and it had nothing to do with astronomy. It actually tracked the timing of athletics games that were held, including the Olympics. We'll come back to that a bit later. So that was one of the many surprises of this mechanism. Actually, I've got so here you can see Olympia there. It's now thought that actually there probably were originally 2 little dials inside, and the other one probably was showing the Calippic cycle. Price also made progress with the big front dial. He realized, for example, that there was originally a little ball that probably painted half black, half white, that rotated to show the phase of the moon. And he also realized that on that big gear wheel we saw before with the 4 sort of spokes in the shape of a cross, there were the traces of structures that had once been carried around on that wheel that had since been broken off. And to work out what those were, he'd seen something similar in his work at the Science Museum in the astronomical clocks from the Renaissance. And in those clocks, there were structures carried around on bigger wheels that were used to model the motions of the planets. So planets, because they don't orbit the Earth, obviously, they're going around the sun at the same time we are, so they do cycle through the zodiac, but not in a constant way. They're speeding up and slowing down. Sometimes they appear to stop and change direction. And in these astronomical clocks, that was modeled using little wheels riding around on bigger wheels. So at the time, the theory for how the planets were moving in this erratic way from ancient Greek times up until the 17th century was the theory of epicycles. Astronomers thought that the planets were moving in little circles at the same time as their big circle around the Earth, so looping the loop, if you like. And so that was modeled in these clocks by using little wheels riding around on bigger wheels. And so Wright thought, well, perhaps this is what was being done in the Antikythera mechanism. So he built it so he had these little wheels for each planet. So the Greeks knew of 5 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And so you can see there would be a little wheel riding around on the bigger wheel with a pin sticking up that would go into a slot of this lever that would then be moving around. So you get that back and forth motion, and that would be transferred directly to the planet pointer. So in his model, he realized that the planets were being shown too. And so not just constant motion, you're turning the handle, but you're actually getting all of these pointers moving around with the erratic motion to model the planets. And when he suggested this, he was working from these very tiny traces. The actual mechanisms that showed the planets haven't survived, and a lot of researchers thought that this just could not be correct. They did not think that the ancient Greeks could possibly have done this. But more recently, with new readings of the inscriptions, it's actually the text talks about the planets and the motions that are shown and includes numbers and ratios that are exactly what would need to have been used for them to show the planets in this way. So the accepted view now is that Wright was actually correct, and it was showing the planets here as well as the sun and the moon. There were still some things that Wright could not work out. He didn't know what that bottom spiral dial was doing, for example. Most of that part of the mechanism was missing. But he had realized that this wasn't just a sun-moon calendar computer. It was, it was showing the planets as well. And then around 2004, he heard that another team was starting work on the mechanism. And this team couldn't really have taken a more different approach. So Wright was working on his own in his little workshop with all of these traditional instruments, pouring through hundreds of radiographs, making everything by hand. This was an international team involving researchers from lots of different disciplines. They had state-of-the-art technology costing millions of dollars. The team was put together by this guy. So second from the left at the top, that's Tony Freeth. So he was a filmmaker in London, and he wanted to make a film about the Antikythera mechanism. But at the time, there wasn't very much new to say about it. Michael Wright hadn't published a lot of his work. And Freeth was a mathematician by training. And so he decided that if he wanted some new results to put in his film, he was going to have to find them out himself. So he put together this team with lots of different academics and representatives of 2 different companies as well who were developing technologies that could help to image the fragments sort of more accurately than ever before. One of those was called X-Tech. It was a little company based in Tring in Hertfordshire, and they were involved in imaging components from industry to check for internal faults, and they specialized in a technique called computed tomography, or CT. And this is using X-rays to image an object, but not just from one direction. They fire the X-rays from hundreds of different directions and then feed all of those images into the computer to build up a kind of virtual 3-dimensional map of the internal structure of the object. The only problem was that for the Antikythera mechanism, they were going to need something that had very high penetrating power, a very powerful beam of X-rays, but also incredibly high resolution to see all the tiniest details. And at the time, no machine of that type existed. But Freeth managed to persuade X-Tech to develop a completely new machine to do this. There it is. They called it Blade Runner because they were hoping that one day they'd be able to use it to image aircraft turbine blades, which they did eventually do, actually. And it weighed 8 tons. In November 2005, they shipped the entire thing to Athens because they couldn't move the mechanism. But it was worth it. They got incredible images of the fragments, down to resolutions of just a fraction of a millimeter. And I just wanted to show you an example. I can just get this playing. Hopefully that's doing something. So this is that biggest fragment, fragment A, with the 4-spoked wheel. And this is just scrolling down through the fragment, so just sort of going through the depth of it. So you can see there's that big wheel, and then we're going through that to see the wheels that are behind it. And then even deeper into parts of the mechanism that you just can't see at all from the outside. So there's that central plate, and then there's more structures behind that. And you can just see how much detail they were able to capture. And then you can see at the end, that's part of the spiral dial on the back of the mechanism. And then just one other really quick one. So this is the same fragment, but this time just being able to rotate it in space to see it from every angle. So that's one of the approaches they had for studying the fragments. And then the other company that was involved was Hewlett-Packard in California. I think that's about to stop. Okay. Hewlett-Packard, where an imaging scientist called Tom Malzbender was developing a technique for modeling how different materials respond to light. And he was doing this initially for developing more lifelike computer graphics. And what he developed was this sort of gadget. It was like a half dome. And then on the dome, he mounted 50 different flash bulbs. And then he would have a camera, and then he would put the dome in front of the object he wanted to image, and then each flashbulb would fire in turn at the same time as he took 50 photographs. So each photo was lit by a different bulb, so lit from a very slightly different direction. And so you can feed all of those images into a computer and build a kind of virtual map of that object's response to light. And he soon realized that if you tweak that virtual map, you can actually start to create lighting conditions that would not be possible in the real world. So you could take something that was sort of dull stone, for example, and tell the computer to make every part of that surface reflect light much more than usual. And you can make that dull stone look like glossy, shiny metal. And that got archaeologists interested, because then you can make very sort of subtle, tiny scratches in the surface of something really leap out and become much more visible. So this is what it did for the Antikythera mechanism. You can see that's what this fragment looks like in a photo, and then this is what it's looked like when you've sort of boosted its reflectivity to light. So the inscriptions really started to leap out. And the CT imaging actually was also unexpectedly really useful for reading the inscriptions, because it turned out that there was a lot more lettering hidden just under the surface of the fragments, because you've got a lot of layers of it all squashed together. And there was a 10-year project after this to read and decipher all of those inscriptions. That was published in 2016. And they were able to read in the end nearly 3,500 characters out of what they think was maybe about 20,000 characters on the device originally. One member of the team said it was like having a whole new manuscript. So together with all of this data, that's really helped to transform again the understanding of the mechanism. So they were able to confirm a lot of Michael Wright's ideas, but they also added to it, and particularly when it came to the back of the mechanism. So this is this team's reconstruction. And crucially, when they did their project, a new piece of the mechanism was found in the storeroom of the Athens Museum that no one had realized was part of this device. And it was part of this bottom spiral dial that had been a mystery up until this point. And so they were able to count the number of divisions and found that it came to 223. Which I'm sure will instantly tell you what this was for. The researchers knew that the ancient Greek astronomers used a 223-month cycle to track and predict eclipses. So the pattern of lunar and solar eclipses roughly repeats every 223 months. And the inscriptions backed this up as well, because in some of these little month divisions, you've got little brief inscriptions, they call them glyphs, and with different symbols that are basically telling you whether there is a solar or lunar eclipse possible in that month or both, and it tells you the time of day or night that eclipse is expected. And there's also little index letters that then refer to more text that's around these dials that gives even more information about those eclipses. And this includes directions, which is thought to be perhaps either the direction from which the disk is obscured, or perhaps changes in wind direction during or immediately after an eclipse, and colours, so black or fiery red, for example. And this was another complete surprise, because the different astronomical models that are used in this device, you know, some of them are more accurate than others, but this was the first thing that was found that has no basis in fact whatsoever. There's no scientific way to predict the colour of an eclipse, for example. But these directions and colours, they did feature in astrology at the time, so not for individual horoscopes, but for bigger things like forecasting the weather or the fate of a king or a whole country. So this added a kind of astrological kind of tinge to the whole mechanism for the first time. I just want to mention like one more feature inside the gearwork, which was possibly like the most impressive, and that was this here. So there's 4 wheels that were sort of called the pin and slot components of the mechanism, and in particular, if you look at, and that's how they looked in the CT. If you look at these two in particular, you've got 2 little wheels, and they're identical. One is above the other, same number of teeth, same size, but they're on slightly different centres that they're turning around. And the bottom one is driving the top one, so there's a pin sticking up from the bottom one into this little slot in the top one. And because they're rotating around slightly different centres, as they turn, this pin is moving backwards and forwards in this slot. So sometimes it's driving this top wheel a little bit slower when it's nearer the centre of the wheel, and then sometimes it's driving it a little bit faster when it's nearer the outside of the wheel. So this little device, so the sort of the motion comes in here, across to there, and then back out here. And all that it's done is just introduced a wobble into the speed, so that it's speeding up and slowing down with a set period. And this is mathematically pretty much equivalent to a mathematical theory of the moon's motion that was developed by an ancient Greek astronomer called Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC. So the moon's orbit around the Earth is not a perfect circle, it's an ellipse, so its distance from us is changing. And so as you look at the moon in the sky, it seems to be speeding up and slowing down, just very tiny amount, depending on where the moon is in its orbit. And the Greeks didn't know about the elliptical orbit, but they did know the timing of this speeding up and slowing down. And so this shows that they had actually modelled that in the mechanism. Wright had seen this originally, but he was kind of confused about it because it sat on this other bigger wheel towards the back of the mechanism that also seems to be turning, and he couldn't quite work out what it would be doing there. But Freeth, when he looked at this, had the benefit of this extra piece of the mechanism, and he was able to work out that this turntable was turning at roughly once every 9 years, and that told him what this was all about, because the moon's orbit around the Earth, the ellipse, the sort of the axis of that ellipse is actually shifting through the zodiac once every 9 years. So not only have they modelled the speeding up and slowing down, they've put it on this turntable to model that shifting in the axis of the moon's orbit as well, which is just so impressive. And so that would have then been fed back to the moon pointer on the front, and probably the moon phase ball as well. And it gets even more impressive than that, because this turntable itself has 223 teeth around the edge. It's a key part of the gear train that leads to that eclipse prediction dial on the back. And what the designer of this mechanism has done is he's put in an extra wheel to convert the motion of this turntable to be just what it needs to be to model the moon. And then he's put in another wheel just afterwards to cancel out that change and reinstate the motion that it needs to have to drive the eclipse prediction pointer. So to reduce the sort of amount of gear wheels that he needs to have a simpler design, he's kind of doubled up on this big turntable. So, well, I'll give you Tony Freeth's words for that. He says, "It's an absolutely unbelievably stunning and sophisticated idea. I don't know how they thought of it. We're just following in the tracks of the ancient Greeks." So just to kind of sum all of that up, you can see how the identity of kind of what people have thought this device was has sort of shifted over time, from Price's calendar computer to Wright's planetarium to Freeth's eclipse predictor. But they're all right, really. It did all of these things. Sometimes I think you could think of it almost like an ancient sort of tablet with all of these different apps in one box. So on the back, you've got this calendar, you've got the athletics games, you've got the eclipse prediction. On the front, you've got this dial showing you the movement of the sun, moon, and planets through the sky, the phase of the moon, and then you've got all this information about what the stars are doing. And actually, just on the front, go back. Even just this dial, you could see this as being multifunctional. According to a historian called Alexander Jones, who has been helping to read the inscriptions, it kind of had a double purpose. Like, you could see it as this is showing you the appearance of the sky as seen from Earth. So it's showing you where the planets were, where the sun and the moon was, as seen from Earth. But you could also see this from the outside as a kind of a model of the Greek cosmos as seen from outside, from a God's eye view, if you like, because he thinks that each of these, from the inscriptions, he's pretty sure each of these pointers had a little ball on it representing the celestial body, and they were different colors: gold for the sun, fiery red for Mars. And he thinks that they were positioned at different lengths along these pointers depending on the distance that the Greeks thought that planet was from Earth. So seen from outside, you've kind of got the Earth in the middle, you've got the sun, moon, and planets all going around in their sort of respective orbits, and then you've got the stars in the background represented by the zodiac scale. So we kind of have half the mystery solved there, if you like. We know what the mechanism was, we know what it did, we know how it worked. But there's a lot more to this. Like, what's the story of the mechanism itself? Like, where did it come from? Who made it? Why? So I just want to talk a little bit about that. And for these questions, you can get quite a lot of information from studies of the shipwreck itself. So this was a big trading vessel, perhaps 30 or 40 meters long. It was packed to the brim with this luxury cargo. It would have been running very low in the water. And this is an artist's impression of what it might have looked like in that storm at Antikythera. And researchers have been, since the wreck was discovered, have been studying the items found from the wreck to try and work out when did it sink, where was it coming from, where was it going. And the statues weren't a great deal of help because a lot of those were antiques. They were already centuries old when the ship went down. But there were other items, so pottery jars that held food and wine, hundreds of them that came from Pergamon and Ephesus on the Asia Minor coast, as well as the islands of Kos and Rhodes. There was glassware from Egypt that was perhaps loaded at the trading stop of Rhodes. So it was very clear early on that this ship came from the east and was heading west when it sank. Our best idea about the date of the wreck comes from the diving pioneer Jacques Cousteau. So he took a team of divers to Antikythera in the 1970s to make a film about it, which you can still get on Amazon, I think. It's very interesting. And they dived down to see if the sponge divers had left anything behind. They excavated a small area of the site. Their techniques included having a massive suction hose that basically hoovered up the seabed and sent everything up to the ship, and then it all kind of tipped out onto the deck of the boat above, which I don't think you'd be allowed to do now. But anyway, they found hundreds of small items. There's this lovely bronze statuette on a rotating base. There's these golden earrings. They found human bones. But for dating, the important thing was they found bronze and silver coins, and these came from the cities of Pergamon and Ephesus on the Asia Minor coast. And they dated the wreck to between 70 and 60 BC, so the first half of the 1st century BC. So it seems that the ship probably started at Pergamon and then sailed down the Asia Minor coast, probably stopped off at Rhodes for supplies, and then was heading west when it sank at Antikythera. And initially it was assumed to be a Roman ship. So in the 1st century BC, the Romans were sort of taking over the whole Mediterranean area, and they carted like shiploads of Greek treasures back home to Rome. But more recently, another team of archaeologists has been excavating the wreck site And they dated lead components from the ship itself. Analysed lead components from the ship itself, so parts of the hull sheathing, anchors, sounding weights. And they found that these components didn't come from Italy, they came from either northern Greece or the Cyclades, so here and here. So it seems that the ship was actually most likely made in Greece. So perhaps it was a Greek trading ship heading back actually to northern Greece rather than on to Rome. We can also get clues from written sources from the time. There are quite a few intriguing mentions of devices that sound a bit like the Antikythera mechanism. And the oldest and sort of most trustworthy source on this is Cicero, a Roman statesman and writer who lived in the 1st century BC. And he was on Rhodes at exactly the time when the Antikythera ship is thought to have docked there. And so he said in one source, he talked about an instrument recently constructed by our friend Posidonius, which at each revolution reproduces the same motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets that take place in the heavens each day and night. And in another source, he talked about an astronomical model invented by Archimedes that he said that Archimedes had thought out a way to represent accurately by a single device for turning the globe those various and divergent movements with their different rates of speed. And for a long time, historians didn't really know what to make of these kinds of stories because Cicero didn't have any technical training. He didn't explain how these devices worked. Some of them appear in fictional dialogue, so we could have just made the whole thing up. But this new reconstruction of the Antikythera mechanism as sort of exactly this implies that actually perhaps he was basing these tales on reality. So let's just look at this first account a little bit more. So Cicero's friend Posidonius, he was a philosopher working on Rhodes. In fact, Cicero was visiting Posidonius on Rhodes exactly when the Antikythera ship is thought to have been there. And Posidonius did a lot of work in astronomy. He would have had access to state-of-the-art technical workshops. And there are actually some other clues that tie this device to Rhodes. One of them is Hipparchus, who I mentioned earlier. So he was one of the greatest astronomers from ancient Greece, and it was his mathematical theory of the variation in speed of the moon. So his theory involved sort of the moon's orbit being slightly displaced from the center of the Earth, so 2 sort of circles with displaced centers. That's very close to what we actually see modeled in that little pin and slot component in the mechanism. So maybe that device was sort of made later on Rhodes, directly influenced by Hipparchus's work. Also, coming back to that games dial, these are the games that are named on the dial, and the top 4 were really big events. They would have been known across the Greek world. But the bottom 2 were much smaller, of only local interest. And this one, Helea, took place on Rhodes. So Alexander Jones, who has been reading a lot of the inscriptions, thinks that this is a bit like a made in Rhodes label, if you like. He thinks that the device was indeed made on Rhodes and perhaps in Posidonius's workshop. But that's not the whole story, because Na was held in northwest Greece. So Jones thinks, and also the month names on the spiral, the calendar, the top spiral on the back of the device, they're also local names, and they come from a calendar that was used in northwest Greece. So Jones thinks the most likely explanation is that this was made on Rhodes with that nice made in Rhodes label, but was customized for a customer. It was being made to order for a customer in northwest Greece, so they've added in the right month names for him, they've added on Na, and was being shipped to that customer when the ship went down. So this is the area here where Na was held, where the month names come from. And that fits really nicely with this newer idea about this as a Greek trading ship. But the Antikythera mechanism itself, it can't have been the only one of its kind or the first of its kind. It's just too sophisticated, too small, sort of too complex. It seems that there must have been other simpler devices of this type before that, perhaps that had been sort of developed over generations, becoming more complex over time. And that brings us to Cicero's other story about Archimedes. because Archimedes lived a couple of centuries earlier on Sicily. I've lost my spot again. Anyway, Sicily over there in Syracuse. And he is actually a quite good candidate for somebody who might actually have invented this whole line of models of the cosmos in the first place. So obviously he was a legendary mathematics and engineering genius, but his father was an astronomer, so he may well have been interested in astronomy. And we know that one of his sort of lost works was called On Sphere Making. And spheres, or the Latin word sphera, this was used as a generic term for this type of models of the cosmos. Researchers argue about whether the device made by Archimedes that Cicero was talking about, would that have involved pointers on flat dials, like with the Antikythera mechanism, or could it actually have been a sphere? These devices later became known as kind of spheres of Archimedes. And this was a model that Michael Wright made, sort of using details in Cicero's accounts. He made this a few years ago to try and prove that he could have done it actually as a sphere. So if you imagine that the Earth is sort of in the middle, in the center of this globe, and then this is a globe representing the stars, the fixed stars, and then you turn it here, and then these pointers are showing the movement of the planets through the sky. And then this represents the horizon here, so these are the stars above the horizon. So he could have done it that way. But either way, perhaps Archimedes was the first to come up with the idea of using mechanical gearing to sort of model the motions of the heavens, and then that got developed over time, perhaps incorporating the sort of latest astronomical theories like epicycles or the Hipparchus's model for the moon as they became available. And that's perhaps as close as we can get to the possible people that were behind this device. But what was it for? And here, most specialists who have studied it, they say it's hard to think of any practical purpose for this device. So that it wouldn't really give you any useful information for navigation that you couldn't get much more easily in other ways. Perhaps you could use that front dial with the positions of the planets for casting horoscopes in astrology. But again, you could do that just as easily with astronomical tables, and it doesn't really explain the other functions of the device. One possible clue is that the inscriptions on the mechanism, they seem to be designed for a non-specialist. They've been described as not so much operating instructions, but more like an extended caption, sort of explaining what you can see on the dials. So the sort of thing that you might find in a textbook, for example, or in, accompanying a museum exhibit. So it seems that this was, rather than a sort of research instrument or a practical tool, it was more a sort of a teaching device for explaining and demonstrating to an educated but lay audience the workings of the heavens. And it was, I sort of described it earlier as maybe a sort of tablet with all these different apps, but it was more than that, of course. It was a model of the universe, of everything that sort of the Greeks understood and thought to be important about the cosmos at the time. And so that wasn't just scientific, it was also social, it was astrological, it was what was going on in the sky, what was going on Earth, all sort of entwined together. And that's a vision that was expressed really beautifully, I think, by a Roman author called Cassiodorus. He wrote a letter in around 506 AD to the philosopher Bertius, and he was describing an Archimedes sphere. And he said it was a little machine pregnant with the cosmos, a portable sky, a compendium of all that is, a mirror of nature. What a thing it is for a human being to make this thing, which can be a marvel even to understand. So I think that's really nice. And it's actually one of the last ever descriptions that we see in the historical record of this kind of device. After that, just disappears. So what happened? It sort of, at first sight, it seems that perhaps this amazing technological tradition, like so many other technologies, just didn't survive the collapse of the Roman Empire. But if you look more closely, you do start to see some hints that at least some parts of this technology did survive. And the first one is this. This is a unique object. It's actually what first got Michael Wright interested in the Antikythera mechanism, and it's a sundial from the Byzantine Empire dating from the 6th century AD that was brought to the Science Museum in 1983 by a Lebanese man, an anonymous Lebanese man. He had it in pieces in his pocket. He wanted to sell it to the Science Museum. And Michael Wright was one of those who studied it, and he reconstructed it from the pieces, and this is the model that Wright built of it. And these sort of portable sundials are well known. They look like this. On the front, you've got a bar that casts a shadow. You can tell the time. But this one was different because it had gear wheels inside. And he worked out that those gear wheels were just 8 gear wheels, were driving a simple calendar on the back that was showing the positions of the sun and the moon in the zodiac, the phase of the moon, the day of the month. And it was driven by this ratchet on the front. So these represent the days of the week, and the user would just click it around once each day. So this is not that long after that letter that I just quoted, and it's much simpler than the Antikythera mechanism, much less accurate, but it's proof that the essence of that idea of using gears to model the heavens survived into the Byzantine Empire. The next time we see anything remotely similar is in this manuscript which surfaced for sale in London in 2005 before it was snapped up by an anonymous dealer. And it's a 12th century copy of a 10th century manuscript attributed to an astronomer called Nastulus who was working in Baghdad. And among other things, it describes what Nastulus called a box for the moon. And it had 8 gear wheels. I keep losing my spot there. And they drove a display. So this was attached to an astrolabe, not a sundial, but it drove a display on the back of the astrolabe showing the position of the sun and the moon in the zodiac, phase of the moon, day of the month. It's exactly the same. And this is several centuries later, and this is now Arabic, not Greek, the Islamic world. So it's showing that that technology has made it through. And there's actually a physical example of this. This is an astrolabe from the 13th century from Iran that's now held in Oxford. And on the front, it looks just like all the other astrolabes that we have. But on the back, here again, you've got the sun and the moon, this time on the same dial. Sun and the moon in the zodiac, phase of the moon, day of the month. And it's got the same 8 gear wheels inside. So it's got that far. And historians are pretty sure that this technology did then make it back from the Islamic world to Europe, where it helped to trigger the invention of mechanical clocks. So the key sort of creative leap in the invention of mechanical clocks was the escapement that we heard about earlier. So it's this back and forth mechanism that sort of regulates a falling weight into even chunks. So you can use a falling weight to sort of drive a mechanism at constant speed. But there's a bit of a puzzle, because usually when you have a new invention, it starts simple and gets more complicated. But the very first mechanical clocks that we see appearing in monasteries and churches around 12th century Europe were not simple. They didn't just tell the time. They were huge astronomical display pieces, really complicated, with layers of epicyclic gearing, and they showed the sun, the moon, the planets, they showed eclipses. Telling the time was really just an afterthought. It was only much later that clocks kind of shrank and simplified and streamlined and became more like sort of the time pieces that we're more familiar with today. And it seems that the most likely explanation is that this technology for making sort of geared models of the heavens had survived and was kind of waiting in the wings, and then when the escapement was invented that enabled these things to be run automatically, it all kind of came together and you had this explosion of these astronomical clocks. Oh yes, what I was going to say about that is that this kind of shows that this isn't actually a lost technology at all, that it did survive, and that there is a direct link from those ancient sort of 2,000-year-old gear wheels that look so familiar to us when we see them in the X-rays through to the watches that we're wearing on our wrists today. I wanted to finish just with this animation, which shows. That's not the right arrow. So this is showing sort of the internal workings of the mechanism, and it was developed by an Italian astronomer called Mogi Vigentini. That's why it's got a lot of Italian subtitles on it. And it's made according to a reconstruction of Michael Wright's. I should just say that at the time, Wright thought that the box had a kind of stepped shape, but actually now he and others agree it probably was more like a shoebox with inscriptions above and below the dials. And I wanted to show it to you just to get across the breathtaking complexity of the wheel so that you can see all of it together, and also because I think it's really beautiful. And while that's going, I'll just say that, so most of the big questions we have about the mechanism have now been answered. So there's still research going on. Researchers are still arguing about sort of smaller points to do with the working, so the exact eclipse prediction scheme used, for example, or how was the varying motion of the sun modeled. But we have most of the big answers. But there is one more puzzle about it that really intrigues me, and that is which came first? Was it the mathematical theories of how the heavens work, or was it these practical models? Because it's always been assumed that the theories came first, and then the Greeks tried to work out how they could represent those in bronze using gearwheels. But it was suggested a few years ago that it might actually be the other way around, that in some cases at least, it was the machines that inspired the theories. So if you take the idea of epicycles, for example, you can imagine that maybe a mechanic was in his workshop trying to use gear wheels, playing around with them, seeing if he could find a way to use them to model the back and forth motion of the planets in the sky. And he realized that he could do it by mounting little wheels on top of big ones. And then maybe that is what inspired the theory of epicycles. And probably the two things, the theoretical ideas and the practical models, were kind of working together, sort of bouncing off each other over time. But I loved the idea that perhaps it was these kinds of devices that were helping to kind of inspire and drive those theories about how the universe works. And this isn't just about any sort of specific theory or mathematical model or particular celestial motion. This is probably true in a much bigger sense as well, because the more we learn about the Antikythera mechanism, the more it seems like devices like this were actually helping to sort of drive and inspire the overarching idea of the cosmos as a machine, the universe as a physical mechanism that has an underlying order to it, that doesn't just work through the whim of the gods, but it's actually working according to rules that we can measure and understand and predict. And for me, that is why this object is so exciting, because within these sort of ancient gear wheels, there is an idea that changed humanity, this metaphor of the universe as a machine, it's a metaphor that became an entire philosophy. Ultimately, this is what triggered science and our modern worldview. So I'm just going to finish on a slide for more information if you're interested. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Joe, thank you very much indeed. That's just fantastic. The complexity of that is just amazing. And then realizing that they had Archimedes, they had Cicero talking about this, they had metal gears. I think they had steam power with Hero of Alexandria. So you kind of wonder, maybe they're on the verge of an industrial revolution if they could have powered this. But clearly they didn't. But all as you've shown, the mechanism has gone through. They must have been very close to that, perhaps. And bringing us to today, it makes you think, well, what are we missing that we could put this and this together and do something completely novel that we haven't imagined? Anyway, we can imagine for ages. Next week, we remain with mathematics and technology, but we're moving forward in time when Dr. James Grime will lecture on Alan Turing and the Enigma machine. So again, more of sort of hidden things happening in boxes. So we hope to see you then. But again, finally, Joe Marchant, thank you very, very much indeed for coming to talk to us this evening.